Ancient DNA is also problematic. 130 million year old weevil DNA is trapped in amber in here. 20 million year old magnolia leaf DNA. And yet DNA is supposed to decay rapidly in a few tens of thousands of years at most. So how did it survive? Flexible, intact proteins in dinosaur material. This is from a T-Rex. You got stretchable, pliable, elastic, soft tissue within T-Rex bones with red blood cells in them and white blood cells in them that are still identifiable. And if you take these materials out and you inject them into mice or rabbits, they mount very specific immune responses to specific protein hemoglobin sequences. And how do you remain intact that long, these protein sequences? Here's the surprise of some of these people who have found these features. I mean, you can imagine pulling a bone out of the ground after 68 million years and then getting intact protein sequences, said John Ashira of Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and Harvard Medical School. That's just mind-boggling how much preservation there is in these bones. The new finding will be viewed skeptically, admitted one of the researchers involved in the two studies. It's very, very, very controversial because most people have gone on record saying that there's an absolute time limit to anything that's protein or DNA, said Mary Schweitzer, who was the first one who started doing this sort of thing, a molecular paleontologist at Carolina State. John Parks in Nature, he writes, there is also the question of how long bacterial biopolymers can remain intact over millions of years in dormant bacteria, or conversely, if bacteria are metabolically active enough to repair biopolymers. This raises the question of what energy source could last over such a long period of time. He's basically mentioning the find of bacteria in 200 million year old salt crystals that when they were taken out and plated, they grew, they were alive. And so that indicates that you have to have intact genome sequences and intact ATP to provide the energy for them to grow, which is amazing if they're really that old. Thomas Lindell, deprived of repair mechanisms provided in living cells, fully hydrated DNA is spontaneously degraded to short fragments over a time period of several thousand years at moderate temperatures. The apparent observation that fully hydrated plant DNA might be retained in high molecular mass formed for over 20 million years is incompatible with the known properties and chemical structure of DNA. Jeremy Sherfus says the same thing in Science. That DNA could survive for such a staggering length of time was totally unexpected, almost unbelievable. All right? So maybe they're not asking the right question. Maybe these things aren't millions of years old. But of course, that's heresy. You can't ask that question. So perhaps, at least from my perspective, there seems to be maybe a little bit of faith involved from even mainstream science. How clear-cut is mainstream science? Is there even the littlest shadow of the doubt? And if not, if you don't think that there is, why are you still a Seventh-day Adventist or even attending a Seventh-day Adventist school? Why are your parents paying so much money for you to be here? Are you all country club Adventists? Are you here just because you were born in it and you grew up in it and you're comfortable with it? Or is it something more to you? Which is better, to stick with something that is fundamentally broken or simply admit that SDAism is mistaken at its very core and move on? Are we real Adventists or just social Adventists? How long do church country clubs survive anyway? You think your children are going to be as impressed with you as to your choice of country clubs? I don't think so. So, also paid representatives. At the very least, your parents believe in it. They're paying for you to be here. What would happen to somebody, let's say, who works for Reebok, going around and saying, I know I work for Reebok, but to be honest with you, Nike makes a better product. You think that person would last very long at Reebok, even if they were in a high executive paid position? It wouldn't last very long. What about at a public school? At a public university, if some science professor went around saying, I know I'm supposed to be teaching about the validity of Darwinian-style evolution, but those ideists and those creationists, I think they have something going on. I think they're actually right here. How long do you think he would maintain his job? Or she? Probably not very long. So the same thing applies to institutions like this. Right or wrong, the SDA Church has a very specific stated position on origins, And they're at perfect liberty to hire those representatives who actually believe what they're hired to teach and preach. And if you don't believe it, how moral is it for you to accept money from an organization that's paying you to represent them? How moral is it for you to accept money from them to fundamentally counter something that they hold to be fundamentally important? To me, even if you think you're right, even if you think that you have to teach or preach this because you don't think it's moral to say something that's a lie, it's better for you to go to like UCR or to some other institution that's perfectly happy and willing to pay you for your Darwinian perspective rather than to stay in an institution that fundamentally holds a different view than you hold. So, any questions? This is usually my favorite time of the... I'm sorry I went on a little long. I thought I could talk faster, but I guess I couldn't. Right. Several issues. Francis Collins and a lot of others like him, like Kenneth Miller, they all take on the title of Christianity, and I'm sure they firmly believe it, honestly. And I really don't think this is an issue of salvation or morality per se. For me, I think this is more of an issue of hope, at least from my perspective. That this is a hopeful position, not necessarily believing one side or the other makes you good or bad, morally speaking. And so I think that you can be a very good person and hold evolutionary views. However, when Francis Collins and Kenneth Miller and others like them, they argue for their beliefs in Christianity, and especially theologians in our own circles who are evolutionists, they argue for their beliefs in Christianity more on internal inspiration or some sort of ethereal sense of the divine, grand magisteria, other terms like that, where they can't really put their finger on it, they can't test it, they can't quantify it, they just have this sense of God. And to me, that's more like a warm, fuzzy feeling that I've never had. To me, I've had indigestion that gives me more stimulus, perhaps, than those sort of arguments. And they just don't cut it for me. I'm speaking to those people like me who don't have this warm, fuzzy feeling of God inside them. God has not spoken to me. I've never had some sort of divine impression that I can really point to say that's God speaking to me. And so for me, what cuts it to me is physical evidence. And if I didn't have the physical evidence, I would be an atheist. And I tend to sympathize more and agree with those like Richard Dawkins and William Provine, who argue that atheism is the more logical course. And I tend to sympathize with that view more than those views of Collins. Even though I respect his view, I tend to sympathize more with Richard Dawkins and Provine and those guys. I think that's more logical of a view. If there's no physical, testable scientific evidence for your religious experience, to me, it doesn't do much for me, if that makes any sense. And I'm sorry, one other thing. As far as intelligent design, I'm not saying it's the end-all, be-all, but I do think it's an important first step. If you're going to, on a scientific basis, take a step outside of atheism, you have to start with the idea that there is evidence of a higher level or at least another intelligence besides humans in existence in this universe. If you can't even get to that step, you're not going to go beyond to Christianity or other forms of identifying who the designer is, if you can't at least come to the conclusion that there is a designer out there. So I believe it's an important first step.